When my father's email arrived titled, "Family Business Discussion," I didn't realize I was walking into a courtroom without a lawyer, and I was the defendant. The subject line sat in my inbox for 3 days like a ticking bomb, glowing accusingly every time I opened my laptop. I must have read those 4 words 100 times, analyzing the clinical tone, the corporate distance, the way he managed to strip all warmth and humanity from what should have been a simple family conversation. But that was Dad. Everything had to sound like a board meeting, even when he was talking to his own children, especially when he was talking to me. I was never his daughter in moments like these. I was a stakeholder, a variable in his endless equations of control and manipulation. If you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own family, hit that like button, because this story, it's for you. This isn't just about money or houses or inheritance. This is about the moment you realize that the people who raised you never actually saw you. They saw a function, a role, a convenient solution to problems they created but never wanted to solve themselves. I remember staring at that email, my coffee growing cold in my hands, feeling that familiar knot of dread settling in my stomach like a stone. The same feeling I'd had as a child when I heard Dad's car in the driveway, that instant calculation. What mood would he be in? What had gone wrong that would somehow become my fault? What new expectation would be placed on my shoulders while my siblings skated by on charm and excuses? The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in my corner office, overlooking a city where I'd built my own empire, my own success, my own life, and still, a 4-word email from my father could reduce me to that anxious little girl hiding in her room, listening to her parents argue about money downstairs. Money. It always came back to money with them. Not love, not respect, not genuine interest in who I'd become or what I'd accomplished. Just money, what I could provide, what problems I could solve, what emergencies I could handle so they didn't have to face the consequences of their own choices. I drove up that familiar driveway with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Not from fear, from rage. Pure, crystalline rage that had been building for years, maybe decades. The kind of anger that starts as a whisper in childhood and grows into a roar by the time you're adult enough to understand exactly how you've been used. The mansion looked exactly the same as it did when I was 12 and hiding in my room, listening to them argue about money downstairs. The same imported stone facade that Dad loved to brag about at dinner parties. The same perfectly manicured gardens that required a full-time groundskeeper. The same iron gates that were supposed to keep the world out, but really just kept us trapped inside with each other. Every blade of grass was perfect. Every flower was placed with mathematical precision. Even the driveway was swept clean, because God forbid anyone think the family wasn't still living in immaculate prosperity. The whole place was a monument to appearances, a shrine to the idea that if something looked expensive enough, no one would question whether you could actually afford it. But I knew better. I'd been paying for this perfection for years. They called it a family meeting, but it felt like a merger I didn't agree to. Walking through those doors, I could smell the tension before I even saw their faces. It hung in the air like expensive perfume trying to mask something rotten underneath. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a stage set, beautiful and hollow and designed for performance rather than living. Mom was in the kitchen, of course, playing her eternal role as the woman who smooths everything over with homemade cookies and nervous laughter. She was wearing her pearl necklace, the one I'd helped her buy when Dad's last investment went south, and they needed to sell her original pearls to cover the mortgage payment. She didn't know I knew about that. She thought she'd been so clever, so discreet, replacing them with replicas and hoping no one would notice the difference. But I always noticed. I noticed everything in that house, because I'd learned early that attention to detail was the difference between peace and chaos, between being useful and being discarded. "Sophie, sweetheart," Mom said, kissing my cheek with lips that trembled slightly. "You look tired. Are you eating enough? You work too hard." The same script she'd been reading for 20 years. Express concern about my well-being while never actually asking what might be causing the stress. Never acknowledging that most of my exhaustion came from carrying their problems along with my own. "Just listen to what he has to say, sweetheart," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the dining room. "You know how he gets when things don't go according to plan. How he gets. As if his cruelty was weather we all just had to endure. As if his tantrums and manipulations were natural disasters rather than choices he made every single day." Mom had spent 35 years translating Dad's behavior, making excuses for his harshness, smoothing over his rough edges so the rest of us could pretend we had a normal family. My siblings were already there, naturally. Marcus, the golden boy who'd never worked a real day in his life, but somehow deserved everything handed to him on a silver platter. He was wearing a suit, an expensive one that I recognized because I'd paid for it when he needed to look successful for some job interview that had led nowhere, like all his job interviews. Elena, the princess who thought the world owed her comfort because she was born beautiful and learned to weaponize tears before she could tie her own shoes. She was draped across the antique sofa like a Renaissance painting, all flowing hair and dramatic sighs, already setting the stage for whatever performance this meeting would require. They looked at me like I was late to my own execution, which, in retrospect, I was. There was something in their faces, a smugness, a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. They knew something I didn't, and they were enjoying the power that gave them. Tell me in the comments in your family, who's the peacemaker and who's the power player? Because in mine, I was supposed to be the fixer, the one who made problems disappear, the one who had money when they needed it, connections when they wanted them, solutions when they'd painted themselves into yet another corner with their reckless, entitled choices. I'd been playing that role for so long, I'd almost forgotten it was a role at all. When Marcus needed bail money after his drunk driving arrest, I was the one who wired funds at 3 a.m. When Elena's art school tuition check bounced, I was the one who covered it and the overdraft fees. When Mom and Dad's house went into foreclosure, I was the one who saved them from homelessness and bankruptcy. And every single time, they managed to make it seem like I was lucky to be able to help. Like my success was a family resource rather than something I'd built with my own hands, my own mind, my own relentless determination to never depend on anyone the way they depended on me. Dad walked in like a CEO entering a boardroom he owned, which he did, or thought he did. This was his house, his rules, his universe where the rest of us were just satellites orbiting his massive ego. He was wearing his power suit navy blue, Italian wool, the kind of thing that cost more than most people made in a month. The kind of thing I'd helped him afford when his last business venture collapsed, and he needed to look successful for potential investors. He didn't hug me, didn't even look at me directly. Just started talking like I was already supposed to know why I'd been summoned, like my presence was assumed rather than requested. "Sophie, we need to discuss the family assets," he said, settling into his leather chair like a king on a throne. "There have been some developments, not disasters, not catastrophic financial decisions, not consequences of years of living beyond their means, investing in get-rich-quick schemes, and treating money like it was infinite because someone else, me, would always be there to bail them out. Developments. Like they were natural phenomena instead of choices, mistakes, deliberate acts of financial recklessness. I remember sitting there, feeling like I was watching a movie about my own life, the chandelier casting shadows across their faces, the way Mom kept wringing her hands, how Marcus couldn't even look me in the eye while Elena examined her manicure like it was the most fascinating thing in the world, the afternoon light filtering through those expensive curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to whatever betrayal was about to unfold. They knew. They all knew what was coming, and they'd decided without me, had probably spent weeks planning this intervention, this restructuring of my life to better serve theirs. I could picture them in this same room, plotting and scheming, dividing up assets they didn't own and making plans for a future that required my continued cooperation without my actual consent. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Dad shuffled through papers with the deliberate slowness of someone who enjoyed creating tension. Mom's nervous breathing. Marcus's foot tapping against the Persian rug, the one I'd helped them buy when their insurance company refused to cover the flood damage from their last renovation. Elena finally broke first, because she always did. "Daddy, just tell her. The suspense is making me sick." Sick. As if my presence was somehow toxic. As if the very act of having to include me in family decisions was a burden they shouldn't have to bear. When Dad announced the new inheritance plan, it wasn't about legacy. It was about control. It was about making sure their mistakes became my responsibility in perpetuity. He pulled out papers, actual legal documents that had clearly been prepared by expensive lawyers, because nothing said family love like hiring attorneys to formalize your betrayal. "We've been talking," Dad began, as if that explained everything. As if talking was the same as including, as if discussion was the same as consent. About the future, about legacy, about making sure everyone is taken care of appropriately. Appropriately. There was that word again. The one that really meant according to our preferences, rather than according to fairness, or according to contribution, or according to actual legal ownership. He started reading from the documents like he was delivering a verdict I'd already been convicted of, his voice taking on that formal, corporate tone that meant he was about to do something terrible while making it sound reasonable. "The beach house will go to Marcus," he announced, as if this was a gift he was bestowing rather than theft he was committing. "He's got the family to think about now, and the kids need stability." Marcus's kids. The ones I'd been sending Christmas money to for 5 years running. The ones I'd paid for summer camps and private schools and orthodontist bills because Marcus couldn't keep a job longer than 18 months. The ones who called me Aunt Sophie with genuine affection while their father treated me like an ATM with legs. Stability. From the man who'd declared bankruptcy twice and blamed it on market conditions both times. The man who'd lost his house, his car, and his wife's engagement ring to bad investments and worse decisions. The man who was currently living in the beach house rent-free because I'd been covering the property taxes and maintenance for 3 years running. "Elena will get the downtown condo," Dad continued, not even pausing to let me react, not even glancing in my direction to see how I was taking this systematic dismantling of everything I'd worked to preserve. "She's building her art career, and she needs the city access." The art career I'd been funding with monthly allowances that were really subsidies. The studio rent I'd been paying because Elena's paintings sold maybe twice a year, and only to family friends who felt sorry for her. The gallery showings I'd used my connections to arrange because Elena's art was mediocre at best, and her networking skills were non-existent. But sure, she needed city access to continue failing upward on my dime, while creating installations that looked like what happened when you gave a child too much finger paint and not enough supervision. "The portfolio will be redistributed," Dad continued, his voice growing more confident as he warmed to his theme of generous benevolence. "Some to your mother's retirement account, some to establish trust funds for the grandchildren. My portfolio. The investment accounts I'd built from nothing, the stocks I'd researched and purchased, the bonds I'd selected, and the mutual funds I'd diversified across multiple sectors. The financial foundation I'd spent 15 years building, treating it like a sacred trust, never touching the principal, always reinvesting, always growing it for a future I thought would be mine. They were talking about my money like it was already theirs, like my success was community property, and my financial security was somehow negotiable. And the house," Dad said, gesturing around us with the casual air of someone discussing the weather, "will remain the family seat, of course. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger, and we need to know we're secure. Secure. In the house I'd been secretly paying for, with the utilities I covered and the staff I employed and the maintenance I arranged. They wanted security funded by my labor, while being systematically excluded from the benefits. They gave away my home while I was sitting right there. The beach house where I'd spent every summer until I was 18, reading novels on the deck overlooking the ocean, where I'd learned to swim, learn to sail, learn to find peace in the sound of waves against sand, where I'd cried over my first heartbreak and celebrated my first business success, calling Mom from the deck to tell her about my first major client while watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. The place I'd assumed would be mine because I was the one who'd been taking care of it. I was the one paying for everything from the heating bills to the landscaping, from the property insurance to the new roof after Hurricane Irene. I was the one who'd spent countless weekends there, not partying or relaxing, but working managing contractors, updating systems, making sure everything was perfect for their occasional visits. Stay with me because what happens next flipped everything they thought they controlled. But as I sat there, listening to them divide up my life like I was already dead, something strange happened. The rage I'd been carrying for years suddenly crystallized into something else. Something colder, something more precise. Clarity. Because sitting in that room, watching my family plan my future without me, I realized something they'd forgotten. Something crucial. Something that was about to make their elaborate redistribution plan completely meaningless. They thought I was the backup plan. I was the foundation. While they were busy treating me like their personal ATM, I'd been making moves they couldn't even comprehend. Because that's what you do when you grow up in a family that only values you for what you can provide. You protect yourself. And 8 years ago, when they'd come to me desperate and broken, begging for help to save the family properties from foreclosure, I'd done exactly that, but not the way they thought. 8 years ago, when they came to me desperate and broken, begging for help to save the family properties from foreclosure, they thought I was just writing them a check, just bailing them out again like I always did, like the good little daughter who never asked questions and never expected gratitude and never, ever said no. They were so relieved, so grateful, so eager to take my money and forget I existed until they needed more. Dad had actually cried real tears, the only ones I'd ever seen from him when I told them I could help. Mom had hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack. Marcus and Elena had looked at me like I was some kind of miracle worker, their big sister swooping in to save the day yet again. But I didn't lend them money. I bought their future and forgot to tell them. If that twist caught you off guard, hit subscribe. There's more truth in this story than any drama series could write. The papers Dad was reading so confidently, they meant nothing, less than nothing. You can't give away what you don't own, and they hadn't owned those properties for almost a decade. When they defaulted on their mortgages, when the banks were circling like vultures, when they were facing complete financial ruin that would have left them homeless and broken, I didn't just help them, I saved them, and I was smart enough to save myself in the process. I remember that day so clearly it might have been yesterday. Dad had called me at 6 a.m, his voice shaking with the kind of panic I'd never heard from him before. The foreclosure notices had arrived. All of them. The beach house, the condo, even this mansion, everything was going to auction in 30 days. Sophie, he'd said. And for the first time in my adult life, he sounded like he needed me, instead of just expecting me to be available. We need help. Real help. I don't know what else to do. I'd driven over immediately, still in my pajamas, my mind already racing through possibilities. They were in the kitchen, all of them, surrounded by legal documents and calculator tape and the debris of financial calculations that didn't add up to salvation. The numbers were staggering. Years of living beyond their means, of treating credit like free money, of making minimum payments while interest compounded into an insurmountable mountain of debt. They owed more than the properties were worth, which meant even selling everything wouldn't save them. "How much do you need?" I'd asked, and the number Dad whispered made my stomach drop. It was more than most people saw in a lifetime, more than anyone should have to borrow from their children, but I had it. That was the thing that still amazed me. I actually had enough to save them. Years of living below my means, of investing instead of spending, of building something real instead of just looking successful. My portfolio could cover their debts and still leave me financially secure. Almost. I can help, I'd told them, watching relief flood their faces like sunrise after the longest night. But we need to do this right. Legally. Properly. They'd agreed to everything without reading the fine print. Why would they? I was family. I was saving them. Why would I do anything except exactly what they expected? I bought every property through my holding company. Not a loan, a purchase. The beach house, the downtown condo, even this mansion we were sitting in. Everything. I paid off their mortgages, their credit cards, their personal loans. I cleared their debts and gave them a fresh start. And then I let them live in their old homes like nothing had changed. No rent. No lease agreements. No formal arrangements of any kind. I just let them continue living their lives while I quietly held all the deeds, all the titles, all the legal documentation that proved what I'd known for years, and they'd somehow forgotten or chosen to ignore. I thought it was generous. I thought it was family. I thought it meant I could trust them to remember what I'd done, to treat me with the respect and gratitude that such a massive sacrifice deserved. I was wrong. That's interesting, Dad, I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. The words came out measured, controlled, like I was commenting on the weather instead of watching my family attempt to rob me in broad daylight. But there's something you should know about those properties. The silence that followed was beautiful. Perfect. Like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself holds its breath and every creature on earth knows something momentous is about to happen. I pulled out my phone with deliberate slowness, savoring the confused looks on their faces, the way Mom's nervous laugh died in her throat, the way Elena's dramatic pose suddenly looked foolish instead of elegant. I opened my real estate portfolio app. Every deed, every title, every legal document that proved what I'd known for years, and they'd somehow forgotten or chosen to ignore. Property after property, all showing the same owner. Meridian Holdings, LLC. My company, my investment, my legal, undeniable, absolute ownership. These properties, I said, holding up the screen so they could all see it clearly, belong to Meridian Holdings, LLC. My company. They have for 8 years. The silence deepened, becoming something almost physical. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear Mom's shallow breathing, could hear Elena's sharp intake of breath as the implications began to sink in. Marcus was the first to speak, because Marcus always was the first to try to find an angle when things went wrong. That's not possible. We live here. We've been living here. Yes, I agreed pleasantly. You have, as my guests. Mom's face went white, that translucent pallor that comes from shock so complete your body forgets how to circulate blood properly. Elena started to cry, not the manipulative tears she usually deployed like weapons, but actual shock and confusion, the kind of crying that comes from having your entire understanding of reality shattered in the space of a sentence. But Dad's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, something I'd never seen before: fear. Real, genuine, bone-deep fear of a man who just realized he'd miscalculated badly, and the consequences were about to land on his head like a building. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had lost that CEO authority. He sounded like what he really was, an old man who'd spent so long manipulating others that he'd forgotten other people could manipulate too. "Check the public records," I said, standing up from the table with movements as smooth and controlled as my voice. "It's all there. Has been for years. You know, the funny thing about being treated like you're invisible is that people stop paying attention to what you're actually doing." I set my phone on the table between us, the screen still showing my property portfolio. Millions of dollars in real estate, assets they'd been living in, planning futures around, counting on inheriting all of it mine. Legally, completely, unquestionably mine. The family that called me heartless was living rent-free in my forgiveness. For 8 years, I'd let them believe they were still the owners of their own lives, while I quietly held all the cards. I'd charged them no rent, asked for no acknowledgement, demanded no gratitude. I'd been the most generous landlord in history, and they'd repaid me by trying to steal from me. "That's impossible," Dad sputtered, reaching for the phone like he could somehow change what was displayed there by touching it. "We never agreed to sell. We never signed anything." "You didn't have to agree," I said, my voice getting harder now, all the years of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet. "You were in foreclosure. The banks owned everything. I bought the properties from the banks, paid off your debts, and let you stay. You want to see the paperwork? I have copies of everything." The next few hours were a masterclass in family dysfunction. What followed was like watching people drown in slow motion, each of them trying different strategies to somehow change reality through force of will or manipulation, or just sheer refusal to accept what was happening. Mom tried to mediate first, her voice taking on that artificially calm tone she used when she was trying to prevent Dad from exploding. "Now, let's all just take a breath and figure this out rationally. There has to be some kind of misunderstanding here." Misunderstanding. As if this was a clerical error, instead of a deliberate attempt to rob me. As if their shock was somehow evidence that they'd been acting in good faith, rather than simply assuming I was too stupid or too grateful to protect myself. "Sophie, sweetheart," Mom continued, reaching across the table like she was going to pat my hand. "Surely we can work something out. Family shouldn't have to deal with all these legal complications." Legal complications. That's what she called my ownership of my own property. Complications. "There's nothing to work out, Mom," I said, gently moving my hand away from her reach. "These are my properties. I've been letting you live in them for free for 8 years. That was my choice. But planning to give them away to other people? That's theft." Elena's sobs had escalated into full theatrical mode by this point, complete with dramatic gestures and declarations of betrayal. "How could you do this to us?" she wailed, as if I'd somehow wronged her by owning things. "We're your family. You're supposed to take care of us. Take care of them." The phrase that had haunted my entire adult life. The expectation that had shaped every decision I'd ever made, every boundary I'd never set, every time I'd said yes when I wanted to say no. "I have been taking care of you," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "For 8 years, I've been taking care of all of you. Free housing, property taxes, maintenance, utilities. Do you have any idea what that's cost me? Do you have any idea what market rate rent would be on these properties?" I pulled out my phone again and started calculating, my fingers flying over the calculator app while they watched in increasingly horrified silence. The beach house alone would rent for $8,000 a month. Conservative estimate. Times 12 months, times 8 years, that's $768,000 I've essentially given you. The condo would be at least $6,000 a month, so that's another $576,000. This house would rent for $12,000 a month minimum, so that's over $1 million right there. The numbers hung in the air like accusations. Mathematics doesn't lie, and the mathematics of their entitlement was staggering. $2.3 million, I said quietly. That's what I've given this family in free housing alone, not counting the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the emergency repairs, not counting all the times I've bailed you out of financial disasters or covered your bills or paid for things you wanted but couldn't afford. Marcus had been doing his own calculations on his phone, his face growing paler with each number. That can't be right. "Check comparable properties," I suggested. "Look up rental rates in these neighborhoods. Add in what I've spent on upkeep and taxes. The numbers are actually conservative." Elena's crying had stopped abruptly, replaced by a kind of stunned silence. Even she could do basic math. and the magnitude of what I'd been providing, what I'd been sacrificing, was finally becoming clear. But Dad? Dad got angry. Really angry. The kind of rage that comes from realizing you've been outmaneuvered by someone you never bothered to take seriously. Someone you dismissed and underestimated and treated like a resource instead of a person. "You're being vindictive," he accused, his voice loud enough to rattle the crystal in the china cabinet. "This is about revenge, not family. You're trying to punish us for including you in our planning. Including me." That's what he called it. Including me in their planning to steal from me. Revenge. As if protecting myself from their exploitation was somehow an attack on them. As if refusing to be robbed was a form of violence. As if setting boundaries was the same as declaring war. "No, Dad," I said, and I could hear my own voice getting harder, colder, like ice forming over deep water. "This is about consequences. This is about what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness for so long that you forget kindness was ever involved." I stood up again, this time gathering my things with the deliberate movements of someone who was done with the conversation, done with the manipulation, done with being treated like a bank account with feelings. "You want to redistribute assets?" I continued, slinging my purse over my shoulder like armor. "Great. Redistribute your own assets. Sell your jewelry, your cars, your art collection. Downsize your lifestyle to match your actual income instead of the income you've been extracting from me for the better part of a decade." "Sophie, please," Mom started, but I cut her off with a look. "No, Mom. I'm done. I'm done being the family emergency fund. I'm done being the backup plan for every poor decision you make. I'm done being grateful for the privilege of solving problems I didn't create." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't shock or confusion or calculation. This was the silence of people realizing that the game they'd been playing was over, and they'd lost without even knowing they were competing. I walked toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the formal dining room like gunshots. At the doorway, I turned back one last time. "You have 60 days, I said, my voice steady and final. "Find your own places to live. I'll help with moving expenses, but this arrangement is over." "You can't do this," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was a businessman. He understood contracts and ownership and legal realities, even when they weren't in his favor. "I can and I am," I replied. "Check with your lawyers if you want, but you'll find that ownership is a pretty clear concept, and I own everything you're sitting in." The drive home was a blur of rage and relief and something that might have been grief. Grief for the family I'd thought I had, for the relationships I'd believed were real, for the version of myself that had spent so many years trying to earn love that had never actually been available. But also relief. Overwhelming, breathtaking relief at finally saying the words I'd been swallowing for years, at finally standing up for myself instead of just standing up for them, at finally choosing my own peace over their comfort. The news broke 3 days later. Not because I called the reporters, I didn't need to. Financial records are public when you know where to look. And when a family like ours suddenly discovers they're not as wealthy as they pretended to be, people notice. Especially in a small city where old money and new scandals are the primary forms of entertainment. The headlines were brutal. "Real estate dynasty discovers. Daughter owns everything. Family fortune actually belongs to youngest child. Inheritance shock. Parents homeless while daughter holds deeds." Homeless. That was the word that stung, even though it wasn't technically true. They weren't homeless, they were jobless. They had 60 days to find their own housing, like millions of other adults managed to do every single day. But the headlines made it sound like I'd kicked puppies out into a snowstorm rather than expected grown adults to take responsibility for their own lives. Would you have done the same? Drop a comment. I read every one, and I want to know where you stand. The phone calls started immediately. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions about family loyalty and forgiveness. Cousins who'd never bothered to return my calls were suddenly experts on gratitude and respect. Aunts and uncles who'd always treated me like the family oddball were quick to lecture me about the importance of taking care of your parents. "Sophie, honey," my Aunt Patricia said in a voicemail that dripped with false sweetness. "I know you're upset, but you can't just throw your family away over money. Your parents gave you everything when you were growing up. Everything, including debt, dysfunction, and a lifetime of feeling like I had to earn my place at their table, including the lesson that love was conditional and conditional on what I could provide rather than who I was." My cousin Michael called drunk at midnight, slurring about family values and how I'd always thought I was better than everyone else. He conveniently forgot that I'd lent him $5,000 3 years ago for his wife's medical bills, and never seen a penny of it back. Even my grandmother, Dad's mother, who I'd always thought understood me better than the rest of them, called to express her disappointment. "Your grandfather would be ashamed," she said, her voice shaking with age and indignation. "Family takes care of family. That's what we do." But the worst calls were from friends who'd always sided with my parents, who'd bought into the narrative that I was difficult and demanding and selfish. Friends who'd watched me bend over backward for years to accommodate their chaos and somehow decided I was the problem. "I always knew you were cold," my former college roommate said when she called to give me her unsolicited opinion. "But this is a new low, even for you." Cold. The word they always used when I refused to set myself on fire to keep them warm. Cold, when what they really meant was unavailable for exploitation. The comment sections of the news articles were even worse, strangers calling me ungrateful, selfish, heartless, people who knew nothing about the situation except what they read in a 3-paragraph news brief, somehow certain that I was the villain in a story they didn't understand. But you know what? I slept better than I had in years, because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations, their emergencies, their endless capacity to create problems and expect me to solve them. I wasn't the family emergency fund anymore. I wasn't the backup plan, or the safety net, or the daughter-shaped solution to every crisis they manufactured. I was just Sophie, a successful businesswoman who owned property, who made smart investments, who had learned the hard way that sometimes the people who claim to love you are really just addicted to using you. The eviction notices went out 2 weeks later, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. They'd made it clear they saw me as an obstacle to their comfort, rather than the person providing it. They'd tried to steal from me, and when that failed, they'd tried to shame me into compliance through family pressure and public opinion. If you've ever had to choose peace over approval, hit like not for me, but for yourself. I hired the best property management company in the city to handle the process. Professional, legal, completely by the book, 60 days notice, just like I'd promised. Assistance with moving expenses, recommendations for affordable housing, even help with security deposits where needed. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I was trying to save myself. The day they moved out was gray and drizzling, which seemed appropriate for the end of an era. I didn't watch from the windows that would have been cruel, and despite everything they'd said about me, I wasn't cruel. But I could hear the moving trucks, could see the boxes being loaded, could feel the weight of 30 years of family history being redistributed into U-Hauls and storage units. Mom cried, of course, but quietly. The kind of tears that come from real grief, rather than manipulation. She'd always been the most genuine of them, the one who'd gotten caught up in Dad's schemes rather than actively participating in them. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, to smooth this over like she'd spent her life smoothing over Dad's rough edges. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Comfort required trust, and trust required honesty. And honesty had been absent from our family dynamics for so long I wasn't sure any of us remembered how to practice it. Elena raged and screamed about heartless sisters and family betrayal, loading boxes into a U-Haul like she was being persecuted rather than experiencing consequences. Her dramatic gestures looked smaller somehow in the gray light, less theatrical and more genuinely desperate. For the first time in years, her tears seemed real rather than performative. "I hope you're happy," she shouted at the house as she loaded what looked like her entire wardrobe into the back of the truck. "I hope this was worth destroying your own family." Destroying. As if setting boundaries was demolition rather than construction. As if protecting myself was the same as attacking them. Marcus tried to negotiate until the very end, suggesting payment plans and equity sharing and other schemes that would keep them in my properties, while giving me nothing but continued obligation. He'd always been the most creative when it came to finding ways to avoid responsibility. And even facing homelessness, he was still looking for angles. "What if we paid you rent?" he suggested as he loaded his golf clubs into his sedan. "Market rate. Whatever you think is fair. We could make this work for everyone." Market rate. After 8 years of free housing, he was suddenly willing to pay market rate. After nearly a decade of treating my generosity like an entitlement, he was ready to negotiate. "The time for that conversation was 8 years ago," I told him. "Or even 8 months ago. Or 8 weeks ago, before you tried to steal from me." Dad didn't speak to me at all during the move. He supervised the loading of his things with the grim efficiency of a general retreating from a battlefield. His face set in lines of anger and humiliation that I'd never seen before. This was a man who'd controlled everything and everyone around him for decades. And suddenly he was just another person who had to find his own place to live like everyone else. But here's what none of them understood. This wasn't about punishment. This wasn't about making them suffer or getting revenge for years of being taken for granted. This was about making them responsible for their own lives for the first time in decades. This was about teaching them something they'd never learned. That actions have consequences, that kindness has limits, and that love without respect isn't love at all, it's exploitation with better marketing. The beach house sold within a month to a lovely family with young children who promised to fill it with laughter instead of resentment. They were a young couple, probably around the age I was when I first started bailing out my family. And they had that bright-eyed optimism that comes from believing in fresh starts and new possibilities. I met them during the final walkthrough, watched their kids run through the rooms where I'd spent so many childhood summers, listened to them talk about their plans for the garden and the deck and the guest room where their parents would visit for holidays. "It's perfect," the wife said, her hand resting on her pregnant belly as she looked out at the ocean view. "Our kids are going to love growing up here." Growing up. The phrase hit me harder than I'd expected. This house had been where I'd grown up too, but it had also been where I'd learned to shrink myself, to make myself useful, to measure my worth by what I could provide, rather than who I was. Maybe these new children would learn different lessons. Maybe they'd learn that love was unconditional, and support was reciprocal, and family meant being valued for who you were, rather than what you could give. The downtown condo went to an artist, a real one, whose work actually sold in galleries that weren't obligated to display it out of family loyalty. She was young, probably Elena's age, but there was a seriousness to her that Elena had never possessed, a commitment to her craft that went beyond wanting to be seen as artistic. "I can't believe I can afford something like this," she said as we signed the papers. "I've been saving for years, working 3 jobs, living in a studio apartment the size of a closet. This feels like winning the lottery. Working 3 jobs, living within her means, saving for years. Everything Elena had never been willing to do. Everything my family had never had to do, because I'd always been there to bridge the gap between their wants and their capabilities. Even the mansion found new owners, a tech entrepreneur who appreciated its history but wasn't imprisoned by it. He had plans to update the systems, modernize the kitchen, turn Dad's formal office into a playroom for his kids. "I love that it has so much character," he said during our first meeting. "But character doesn't mean you can't make improvements, right? Honor the past but live in the present. Honor the past but live in the present." I wished my family had learned that lesson. They'd been so invested in maintaining the appearance of their past prosperity that they'd never learned to live within their present reality. 6 months later, the chaos quieted. They were rebuilding, and so was I. I got updates through the family grapevine, because families are gossip networks disguised as support systems. The information came filtered through relatives and friends, little snippets of news that painted a picture of people learning to live within their means for the first time in decades. Mom and Dad had downsized to a small house in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place Dad had spent his life looking down on, where the lawns weren't professionally maintained and the cars in the driveways were practical rather than prestigious. But according to my cousin Sarah, they seemed lighter somehow, less stressed. Like the weight of maintaining an unsustainable lifestyle had been lifted from their shoulders. "Your mom's actually gardening," Sarah told me during one of our coffee dates. "Like really gardening. Vegetables and everything. She seems almost happy." Happy. It was a word I'd rarely associated with my mother, who'd spent most of my childhood managing Dad's moods and mediating between his expectations and everyone else's limitations. Elena had moved back home and gotten a job, an actual job at a local gallery. Not as an artist, but as an assistant, helping with installations and sales, and the unglamorous work that actually kept galleries running. According to the same family grapevine, she was good at it. She understood art, understood artists, and had developed actual skills instead of just artistic pretensions. "She's different," my Aunt Patricia admitted during one of her guilt trip phone calls that had gradually evolved into actual conversations. More grounded, I guess. Like she's finally living in the real world instead of some fantasy version of it. The real world, where talent had to be backed up by work, where dreams had to be funded by effort, where wanting something wasn't the same as deserving it. Marcus had started his own consulting business, and from what I heard, was actually working for his money for the first time in his life. The bankruptcy and eviction had somehow motivated him in ways that all my bailouts never had. When you know there's no safety net, you learn to fly differently. "He's up at 5 every morning," my grandmother told me, her voice full of surprise that suggested she'd never seen Marcus voluntarily wake up early for anything. Building client lists, making cold calls, really hustling. I never thought he had it in him. Neither had I. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe by always being available to catch them when they fell, I'd prevented them from learning how to land on their feet. Sometimes losing comfort is how you find character. And me? I was expanding my business, making new investments, building something real instead of propping up something rotten. For the first time in years, my money was working for me instead of disappearing into the black hole of family crises and poor decisions. I was dating someone who liked me for who I was rather than what I could provide. David was a teacher, which meant he made about 1/10 of what I did, and had never once asked me to pay for anything expensive. He brought me flowers from his own garden and cooked dinner in his tiny apartment and listened to my stories without calculating what my experiences might be worth to him. "Your family sounds exhausting," he said one night after I'd told him about yet another guilt trip voicemail from a relative. "How did you survive that for so long?" How had I survived it? I'd survived by believing that love required sacrifice, that family meant obligation, that being needed was the same as being valued. I'd survived by making myself indispensable, and then being surprised when people treated me like a tool rather than a person. I was sleeping through the night without worrying about which family crisis would demand my attention next. I was making plans for my own future instead of constantly adjusting my life to accommodate their emergencies. I was learning what peace felt like when it wasn't purchased with compliance. If you're still watching, that means you felt this story. So subscribe, because next time, we're talking about healing, not just surviving. The call came 6 months later, just as I was getting used to the quiet. Dad's voice on my voicemail, careful and formal. "Sophie, I'd like to speak with you." At your convenience. At my convenience. Not a summons, not a demand, a request. The difference was subtle but significant, like the difference between thunder and applause. I listened to the message 3 times before calling him back. His voice sounded different, older maybe, but also less rigid. Like some essential tension had been released. "Thank you for calling back," he said when he answered, and even those 5 words sounded strange coming from him. Dad didn't thank people. Dad expected responses, like he expected sunrise automatically, without gratitude. "What did you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. I'd learned not to rush toward hope when it came to my family. Hope was dangerous when dealing with people who'd spent decades disappointing you. "I'd like to meet," he said. "If you're willing, I have some things I'd like to say." Some things to say. Not demands to make or problems to solve or emergencies to handle. Just things to say. We agreed to meet at my office. Neutral territory. Professional space. The place where I was respected instead of tolerated. Where my success was acknowledged rather than resented. He came to argue. I came with evidence. But the argument never materialized. Instead, he sat across from my desk, in my office, in the building I owned, and did something I'd never seen him do before. He apologized. "I was wrong," he said, and the words sounded rusty, like he'd never used them before. "About a lot of things. About you, especially. Wrong. Not mistaken or misunderstood or operating with incomplete information. Wrong. The kind of wrong that required acknowledgement rather than explanation." He told me about the past 6 months, about learning to budget, to live within their means, to make choices based on what they could afford, rather than what they wanted, about watching Elena develop actual work ethic and seeing Marcus build something with his own hands and mind instead of riding on family connections. "Your mother's happier," he said, his voice taking on a wonder that suggested this was a surprise to him. "Really happier. Not just making the best of things, but actually content. She said she feels like she's living her own life for the first time in years. Her own life. Not the life required to maintain an image or satisfy external expectations, but her own actual life with choices and consequences, and the satisfaction that comes from earning rather than receiving. I never realized how much stress we were all carrying," Dad continued. "How much energy it took to maintain something that wasn't real. We were living like wealthy people while being subsidized by our daughter. That's not wealth. That's charity. Charity. Finally, someone was calling it what it was. Not family support or temporary assistance, or helping out in tough times. Charity, long-term, systematic financial support for people who were capable of supporting themselves but chose not to. You gave us something we needed more than money," he said, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. "You gave us consequences. Consequences. The thing I'd been trying to avoid my whole life, the thing I'd been protecting them from, turned out to be exactly what they needed to become functional adults. It wasn't a reunion. We didn't hug and cry and promise to be a better family. The damage was too deep, the patterns too ingrained, the trust too broken for that kind of Hollywood ending, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, the admission that I'd been right to protect myself, right to demand respect, right to refuse to be their lifelong solution to self-created problems. "I want you to know," he said before he left, standing up from the chair with movements that seemed easier than when he'd arrived. "I'm proud of you, not just for your success, but for your strength, for doing what needed to be done, even when it was hard. Proud." Another word I'd rarely heard from him. Not grateful, not impressed by my usefulness, but proud. Proud of my strength, rather than my compliance. Proud of my boundaries rather than my flexibility. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the city lights come on as darkness fell. The same view I'd had for years, but somehow it looked different. Brighter, maybe. Or maybe I was just seeing it more clearly. Boundaries aren't betrayal. They're survival. 6 months later, we had dinner. All of us. At a restaurant we all paid for separately, the check divided equally like adults eating together rather than children being treated by a parent. It was strange. Sitting around a table where no one expected me to solve their problems or fund their desires or smooth over their conflicts. Elena showed me photos of her new apartment, small but hers, earned with her own money from her actual job. She talked about her work at the gallery, about artists she was learning from, about the difference between creating for attention and creating for its own sake. "I'm actually learning things," she said, her voice carrying a satisfaction I'd never heard before. Real skills, not just artistic techniques, but business skills, people skills. I never realized how much I didn't know about actually working. Not just showing up or looking busy or trading on family connections, but actually working, actually earning, actually contributing value rather than just extracting it. Marcus talked about his business, his real business, the one he'd built from scratch after burning through every connection and favor he'd accumulated over the years. He was proud of it in a way he'd never been proud of the jobs he'd inherited or the opportunities he'd been handed. "It's harder than I thought it would be," he admitted. "But it's mine, you know? Every client, every contract, every success, I earned it. I never understood the difference before. The difference between achievement and entitlement. The difference between earning respect and demanding it. The difference between building something and just receiving it." Mom asked about my life like she actually wanted to know the answer instead of just waiting for her turn to ask for something. She listened when I told her about David, about my business expansion, about the volunteer work I'd started doing with young entrepreneurs. "You sound happy," she said, and there was surprise in her voice. Not the surprise of someone discovering something new, but the surprise of someone recognizing something that had been absent for so long they'd forgotten what it looked like. Happy. I was happy. Not relieved or satisfied or vindicated, but actually happy. The kind of happiness that comes from living authentically rather than strategically, from being valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. We weren't the family we used to be. We were better than that. We were honest. I stopped mistaking silence for peace. Now I live in both on my own terms. Sometimes I drive past the old mansion, now painted a cheerful yellow instead of imposing gray. There are bicycles in the driveway and a trampoline in the backyard and basketball hoop over the garage. The new family turned it into what it always should have been, a home instead of a monument to ego. The landscaping is different too, less formal, more lived in. There's a vegetable garden where Mom's rose garden used to be, and toys scattered on the lawn like evidence of actual childhood rather than the performed perfection that had characterized my own growing up. And sometimes I walk on the beach near where our old house used to be, watching the waves erase footprints the way time erases old wounds. The new owners wave when they see me walking past. Their children build sandcastles that get knocked down and rebuilt every day, understanding instinctively what it took my family decades to learn. That destruction can be the first step toward building something better. The beach house has a different energy now. Where it used to feel heavy with expectation and performance, it now feels light with possibility. The new family has added a swing set and changed the formal dining room into a playroom. They use the deck for barbecues instead of dramatic confrontations. If this story made you feel something like, comment and subscribe. Not just for stories like this, but for every voice that learned the hard way peace is priceless. And sometimes, family isn't blood, it's boundaries. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not a story about cruelty or heartlessness, or any of the things they called me when the dust settled. This is a story about what happens when you finally stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. This is about the moment you realize that love without respect isn't love at all. It's exploitation dressed up in holiday dinners and birthday cards. People still ask me if I regret it, if I miss the old days, the old dynamics, the simple certainty of being needed, even if I wasn't valued. And the answer is no. I don't miss being invisible except when they needed something. I don't miss being taken for granted. I don't miss the weight of their expectations and emergencies and endless capacity to create chaos while expecting me to provide order. What I have now is better than what I lost. I have relationships based on choice rather than obligation. I have respect instead of resentment. I have peace instead of performance. I have love that doesn't come with a price tag, or an expectation, or a hidden agenda. And most importantly, I have myself. The self I was before I learned to shrink, to make them comfortable. The self I was before I started measuring my worth by how useful I could be to people who never bothered to see me as a complete person. The self who was always there, waiting patiently for me to remember she existed. That's the real story, not about money or property or legal documents. About the day I stopped being their daughter and started being myself. About the moment I realized that family loyalty that only flows one direction isn't loyalty at all, it's servitude, and I was done serving. I was finally, completely, gloriously done. The woman I am now wouldn't recognize the woman I used to be, the one who apologized for taking up space, who felt guilty for having boundaries, who believed that love meant letting people use you until there was nothing left. That woman is gone, and I don't mourn her. She was never real anyway, just a collection of other people's expectations wearing my face. The real me was always here, underneath the people-pleasing and the endless accommodation, and the desperate need to be needed. The real me owns property and builds businesses, and chooses her own family from people who value her for who she is, rather than what she can provide. The real me sleeps peacefully and loves freely, and sets boundaries without apology. The real me learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's dysfunction. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people experience the consequences of their choices. That sometimes family means walking away from the people who share your DNA, and walking toward the people who share your values. This is my story, not the story they wanted me to have, where I remained forever grateful and forever available and forever willing to sacrifice my own well-being for their comfort, but my actual story, where I learned that peace is possible and boundaries are necessary and real love doesn't require you to disappear. If you're still here, still listening, still feeling the weight of family expectations that don't serve you, know this: you are not selfish for wanting to be valued. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not ungrateful for refusing to be used. You are just human, trying to build a life worth living on your own terms. And that's not just your right, it's your responsibility. To yourself, to the people who actually love you, and to the person you could become if you stopped being the person everyone else needed you to be. That's the real lesson here. Not about money or inheritance or family dynamics, but about the moment you realize that your life belongs to you, and you get to choose how to live it. Choose wisely. Choose authentically. Choose yourself. Because in the end, that's the only choice that really matters.